much before I can remember, at least effectively before I can remember. It's one of those things that's just been around for nearly forever, it seems like. So the Patriot Act has allowed for a lot of pretty dang terrible things when it comes right down to it. And the Patriot Act has allowed for the FBI to spy on your average American's cell phone without any sort of ramifications. It also allowed for wiretapping and all sorts of things. All sorts of very, very terrible things, and we've been covering that pretty extensively here on Hot News Talk Radio, and we're really, really concerned with what the Patriot Act may or may not be doing next. So the Patriot Act might be going away, but it also might not be. So the FBI is worried that surveillance tools are now in jeopardy amid the Patriot Act debate. Now, the Patriot Act is set to sunset or expire on the 1st of June, which means we only have a few days left until that happens. So looking at my calendar here, the official Hot News Talk Radio calendar, that means we have 3 days, including today, until Monday, which is the 1st of June. So Monday, the 1st of June, is when the Patriot Act is set to expire. Now, until something horrible happens, or unless something horrible happens, and on the 31st they decide to extend it, then the Patriot Act is going to expire on the 1st. And that's a good thing. Now, some people may not think it as that, but I definitely believe that it is a very good thing that the Patriot Act is set to expire. The main reasoning behind that is that the Patriot Act has allowed for a lot of really terrible things that are not legal in any stretch of the imagination. And there's not really any justification for half of what goes on under the Patriot Act. Now, they can make the excuse that it's legal because they say it is, but if it's a violation of the Fourth Amendment, then it's really not very legal. And that's a problem that we've been running into quite a lot, where there's sort of a contradiction there. Well, the obvious answer, right, is that if it's not constitutional, that it's not legal even from inception. It's just not legal. There's no way this could be legal. If it's a violation of the Fourth Amendment, then it's not legal. But for some reason, there are people who are defending it, particularly on the Republican side. We're seeing that quite a lot, and some on the Democratic side as well, to be fair. We're seeing that quite a lot, where it's just disturbing how very disconnected they are with actual constitutional law and with how they think the Patriot Act should work. You know, that's their basis, is how they think the country should run versus what is actually legal. So to give you a crash course real briefly, the Fourth Amendment says it's the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Now, with the Patriot Act, it's allowed for warrantless searches. Now, that immediately is not legal. A warrantless search is not legal. There's no bones about it. Warrantless search is not legal. Stop and frisk, not legal. It's not a warrant. It does not have a warrant behind it, so it's not legal. It's just immediate. It's just easy. You know, it's easy to determine these sorts of things. It's like, oh, well, is it in the Patriot Act? You know, and they say, well, yeah, it is, so it's legal. But is it in the Constitution? Well, it's actually expressly forbidden in the Constitution. Well, then it's not legal. This should be easy. And it is easy for you and for me, but for some reason, the guys in Washington don't particularly care about the Constitution and probably haven't for a very long time, if they ever actually did. So, according to the AP in Washington, as Congress is wrestling over renewing the bulk collection of Americans' phone records, federal law enforcement officials are warning that legal authority is also at risk for lesser-known surveillance tools that are even more valuable in fighting terrorism. The Patriot Act authorities give the FBI the flexibility to intercept the calls of terror suspects who continuously switch phones during the course of an investigation, and to conduct surveillance on lone wolf individuals who pose threats but aren't affiliated with an international terrorism organization. U.S. officials have defended the need for those powers over the last decade, but have amplified those efforts in recent weeks as the expiration dates for their authority nears without any signal of a congressional compromise that would keep them from lapsing along with other parts of the act on June the 1st. The Senate returns to session on Sunday, facing a deadline to reach a last-minute agreement to renew a once secret National Security Agency program that collects Americans' phone records in bulk. Provisions of the Patriot Act dealing with lone wolf targets and roving wiretaps will also expire at midnight with the phone records program. So midnight on Sunday night, the Patriot Act will expire, which means the NSA will have to dismantle quite a lot of their elements, and the FBI will as well. So basically the DOD and the DOJ will have a lot of work to do as soon as midnight Sunday rolls around. Now, this is good news for us because it means that we won't be spied on nearly as much. Now, this is not a question of are they spying on terrorists or are they spying on Americans? Because it's very easy. They're spying on Americans. They're spying on American citizens. It's plain and simple. They just are, and it's extremely unfortunate that that is the case. But that is in fact the case, and we've been seeing that repeatedly as time is going by. Now, notice how upset people got when Edward Snowden came out with his revelations about the NSA. Notice how upset people who work in these different agencies got as a result of that. The president was upset. The different people in different houses were upset. I mean, the House, I should say. The people in the House were upset. The folks in the Senate were upset. All sorts of people were just upset about this revelation of NSA. Not because they were upset about what was contained within the revelations, but they were upset that there was somebody who had the guts to actually expose what went on. And it's just astounding to me that there are people who would defend these different senators and such, saying that they're upholding their oath to defend the Constitution. Definitely. Well, no, not really, because then they would be fighting against these warrantless searches. It doesn't seem to me that really much of anybody is putting forward a very good effort to protect us when it comes to these unreasonable and unwarranted searches and seizures. Nobody's really putting up a good effort to protect us when it comes to people in government. Notice how they talk about how it's their duty to defend America, right? They always talk about that. But when it comes right down to the greatest threat, which is internal strife and internal affairs, they don't really want to face that problem. They never really want to face the problem of, well, the FBI is doing terrible things, but we don't need to talk about that one. They'll always sort of get away from that point where we talk about the FBI, and they'll sort of shy away from that, and they'll explain to you that, well, the FBI does a very necessary job and yada yada yada. Well, it doesn't really seem that way. It's not really necessary if it's evil. They'll say, well, it's a necessary evil. Well, there's no such thing. So I'm still failing to see your point here. FBI Director James Comey has called bulk phone collection a useful tool to the FBI's counterterrorism efforts, but recently he has expressed more concern about being able to maintain the lone wolf and roving wiretap capabilities, as well as separate Patriot Act provisions that allow the FBI to obtain secret court orders to collect documents such as hotel and travel records during terrorism investigations, and which also would be affected by the deadline. Now, again, this is a good thing because this means that they can't be collecting bulk records on us. Now, the constant argument is that, well, I haven't done anything wrong, so why should I worry? Well, it's a matter of principle. And if you don't understand matters of principle, then you're kind of a lost cause. But if it definitely is a matter of principle that we're talking about here, where the principle of the thing is that this is a crime under the constitutional law. This is a crime to steal people's information, even if it is for counterterrorism purposes. It's highly illegal to capture people's information this way. Well, think about it this way. If I had a cell phone collection device, right? I had a cell phone data collection device, and I'm sitting there in my van outside your house, and I'm collecting all of your cell phone communications when you're calling your boyfriend, you're calling your ex-husband, you're calling, I don't care. You're calling somebody. And I'm sitting there listening to your conversations and making notes and all of your SMSs, and I'm taking notes on those too, looking for anything that could possibly be suspicious. Or not even that, I'm not even manning the thing. And if you say a keyword, which could be anything, you say a keyword, I'll tune into that and check the phrases that were used when you said that keyword. And I'm still spying on your phone, right? I'm still collecting these records in bulk. You would take offense at that. You would have quite a big objection to that. You say, well, you're a creepy dude for doing that. Well, yes, I am. And so are the guys in the federal government who are doing exactly the same thing. You see, it's no different. If I do it, suddenly it's terrible and I should never be doing these sorts of things. But if somebody in office does it, then it's okay. Well, think about a lot of the things the police do, where they'll just beat up people for minor offenses. And think about if I demanded money from you and you didn't give it to me and I beat you up. That would be kind of a big problem. But if I demand that you sign this piece of paper and you don't do it and I beat you up then, you probably still see that as a problem as well. Well, okay, but if it's a cop, and he gives you a speeding ticket and you're trying to dispute it when you're on the road there and he beats you up, people will say, well, thin blue line, my thin blue line. People go nuts about that. You got to make these parallels. If it's okay for one party to do it, but not okay for another party to do it, then it's probably not okay at all to do what this particular thing is. We keep running into that. We keep running into this conundrum. like with okay, as an example, we talk about nuclear weapons, where it's okay for us to use nuclear weapons but not okay for anyone else, or it's okay for us to use biological weapons but not okay for anyone else. We have a whole farm's worth of biological weapons that we're working on cultivating. Anthrax, remember the whole deal with the Pentagon and anthrax, and that's okay that we're doing that. But for some reason, if another country does exactly the same thing, they're not justified and they can't have weapons of mass destruction and yada yada, and we go nuts and we go to war with them. I'm not sure why we're allowed to do that. Why isn't some international court stepping up and saying, hey, that's not legal? Why isn't the UN coming forward and saying, hey, you really can't be doing that because that's not legal? Well, unfortunately, we make up most of the UN when it comes to ground forces, so any sort of opposition would be very, very easily quelled. So Mr. Comey says that I sure hope Congress figures out a way to make sure I don't lose these essential tools, he said during a visit on Tuesday to the New Haven, Connecticut field office of the FBI. Attorney General Loretta Lynch warned Wednesday that against permitting the expiration of vital and uncontroversial tools that we use to combat terrorism and crime. I'm not sure what she's doing there with saying that it's uncontroversial. I guess she thinks that by calling it uncontroversial, it will suddenly cease to be. I don't think she knows how words work. But civil liberties lawyers say that the FBI already has the tools it needs and it hasn't presented enough information to justify the use of these additional authorities. The ACLU is accusing intelligence officials and some of Congress of scaremongering about the Patriot Act and says the debated authorities give the government too much discretion in national security investigations. Existing law provides ample authority for the government to obtain information about individuals who are planning acts of terrorism, ACLU lawyers wrote in a memo urging Congress to let the provisions expire. The FBI has had roving wiretap authority since the 1980s for criminal investigations such as drug cases, and the Patriot Act of 2001 extended its use for counterterrorism and counterintelligence investigations. That authority lets federal agents, instead of seeking permission to tap each separate phone an individual may use, eavesdrop continuously on targets regardless of the device that they're using. Law enforcement officials see it as an effective way to thwart suspects who try to avoid detection by constantly changing phones, including going through a series of burner cell phones. Except even so, going through a series of burner cell phones still does actually work in some cases. So the argument is kind of moot. If there's somebody who is bound and determined to get around government surveillance, they're going to find a way. It's really not as hard as they might have you think. There are tools out there that will certainly help you out in your effort to avoid surveillance in that regard. But think about it this way. Is there a constant surveillance on all frequencies of all radio communications? I mean, sure, there probably is some guy in some government office listening to 1240 a.m. Probably, maybe. If I say a keyword, then I'll be keyed up, and they'll look at my profile and my LinkedIn profiles and my Facebook and my Twitter, and they'll go to my address with their panel vans, and they'll look inside my bedroom window and all that sort of thing. Sure, that could happen. But what about walkie-talkies? Something as simple as that. Do they listen to those frequencies? What about something as simple as shortwave radio? Do they listen to all the frequencies of shortwave? Certainly there's a way to get around government surveillance. And there's probably other methods of communication that I'm not even aware of that are used to get around government surveillance. I think about it this way. The prime example that they use, case in point, is the Boston Marathon bombing. And I know it's kind of irreverent to invoke the name of the Boston Marathon bombing. It is a horribly tragic event, right? And this is in no way meant to make light of this awful, awful event that happened in Boston with the marathon bombing, where people had their legs blown off and people died and all sorts of terrible things happened. But think about how it wasn't stopped, right? I mean, the very fact that it happened is evidence that these NSA programs can't be 100% effective. There's no way, because this act of terror went on, and surely either Tamerlan or Yohar Tsarnaev used a cell phone at some point, right? I mean, surely they're young adults. They're actually Yohar Tsarnaev was my age when he went about this terror effort. So he used a cell phone, no doubt. He had social media accounts. I mean, we know that, and so did Tamerlan. And so did whoever else they were talking with. So surely the NSA could have looked at this information and determined that, yeah, in fact, this is a prime suspect for counterterrorism experts, and we need to definitely stop them in their tracks and yada yada. The fact of the matter is, even if that happened, it didn't work. Whatever effort they used didn't work. So it's pretty clear, actually, that these NSA efforts don't actually do much of any good, if any. what's the reason now? What's the actual reason behind this NSA surveillance? Is there really somebody out there who sits in their office and thinks, boy, I'm doing a good thing right now? I'm doing the absolute best thing I can do, and I'm really helping out the American public. Is there anyone who sits in their office over at the NSA and really thinks that? I kind of don't think so. I mean, think about Edward Snowden, who sort of broke free of the chains of bureaucracy and decided to give us this information. I don't know what his motives were. It seemed to be that he valued the Constitution a bit and decided to give up this information to us. But I don't know what his true motives were. Nobody does except for him. But it's sort of his evidence that there's not a very good environment in the NSA offices, not a very secure environment either. At least during the time of the Boston Marathon bombing, there was not a very secure environment over at the NSA. Something that has to be kept in mind when we're talking about this surveillance, how it hasn't actually stopped any terror operations. There was still the underwear bomber. Remember him? Yeah. There was still the shoe bomber. Remember him? Yeah. But all of these things happened despite NSA surveillance. So no matter what you say to defend NSA surveillance, you have to contend that terror acts and acts of terror still can happen despite these NSA efforts. And they won't actually tell us if they've stopped any terror efforts, so we don't know if it's doing any good, although internal review from them has said that they haven't really done much good. So it sort of seems that there's no real reason to continue these programs. Well, Todd Hinnon is a former acting assistant attorney general of the Justice Department's National Security Division. And he said, I think terrorists increasingly engage in the kind of sophisticated tradecraft that spies and foreign intelligence agencies do, and the same authority is required to investigate them, said Todd Hinnon. He said the lone wolf provision, meanwhile, enables FBI surveillance of a non-U.S. person who is suspected of plotting terrorism but aren't agents with any foreign powers or connected to any terror groups. So with that power, a judge can authorize the interception, even if he can't say, well, that they are Al-Qaeda. No, they are ISIL, or no, they are AQAP, Comey said at a Georgetown University summit last week, using acronyms for the Islamic State and for Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula. So the FBI has said the authority was shown to be necessary in the case of September 11th conspirator Zacarias Moussaoui and the events leading up to the 9/11 attacks. The FBI officials wanted to seek a surveillance warrant under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, but determined that they lacked evidence tying Moussaoui to a foreign power. But a 2013 Senate Judiciary Committee report said that FBI agents and lawyers had misunderstood the law and failed to use powers which they already had. So it appears that the FBI is just incompetent and not very good at doing their jobs, and they're whining about how they need more power even though they have more than enough. So this is no surprise, actually, that federal agencies are not very good at doing what they're supposed to be doing. Federal agencies are, bar none, the worst agencies in the world, right? When we were talking about entities of any sort of say bureaucratic capacity, all of these different federal agencies are just the worst because they're bad at managing themselves. They're bad at doing their own jobs. These people who work at these agencies, and there's no reason to trust them. There is absolutely zero reason to trust the CIA or to trust the FBI or to trust any of these other national agencies, the NSA, the CIA, the already named the CIA, the IRS, all these different agencies. There is no reason whatsoever to trust any of them. They give us no good reason other than, well, you should because we're the government. That's really the only reason that they ever give for trusting them. And that's not really good enough for me. I don't know about you, but that's not really good enough for me. So it's appearing that faith is being lost in the stocks are being sold off in the federal government. People are losing faith in the federal government. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends on what your outview or your worldview is, I should say. If you're somebody who supports a national system, then obviously this is bad news for you. If you're somebody who's invested in local economy, then this is very good news for you because the collapse of the national system means a greater focus on the local economy. It'll be the only thing left at that point. So it doesn't appear that if these federal entities disappeared, that anarchy would reign and there would be people slaughtering people in the streets. Yeah, this might happen in smaller areas and smaller capacities all around the world, or all around the country, I should say. But really, it's very vain of us to think that the world is propped up on the fulcrum of the United States. It doesn't appear to be that way, really. So the whole argument is sort of null and void when it comes right down to it, where people say, well, people need us. People need the federal government. I don't know about you, but I don't. I've never encountered any situation where I was really thankful for their existence as a federal government. So I guess maybe you might call me anti-government. Maybe I'm just pro a different form of government. Maybe I'm pro self-government, perhaps. I'm not militant, so don't get that confused. This is Digital Drive.
This is a mob mode. This is the mob mode. What kind of fool do you think I am? You think I know nothing about my...
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
News Talk 1240. Hi, this is your computer speaking. I don't feel so well. It's like I've come down with a bug, and I'm getting slower.
Affordable Computers. We fix sick computers. Your hometown guys at Affordable Computers will repair your PC in half the time of the big boys at an affordable price. No tricks, no gimmicks, no computer speak technobabble. Just good, quick, and courteous affordable service and repairs. Want to affordably supercharge your PC? Affordable Computers on Highway 58. Affordable Computers hand builds all desktops in-house. If you're looking for a better-than-new refurb laptop, $150 will get you a Dell or another name brand at Affordable Computers. Affordable Computers, Highway 58, between Arby's and Taco Bell. Also Fort O, Battlefield Parkway, near Holcomb's. Affordable Computers, we service what we sell. Call 499-1975. That's 499-1975.
Wow, this is amazing. I'm feeling great. Supercharged.
Do you feel better outside your home or business than in? Indoor air quality is important. Mildew, mold, smoke, water, and rodent damage are prime causes of poor indoor air quality. Ducts, Indoor Air Professionals, better known as Duct Busters, cleans HVAC systems using 127 definable Duct Busters steps. Let Mark Thompson address the indoor air quality at your business to help reduce employee illnesses. Prevent fires by cleaning your dryer vents. Mark and his parents, Dick and Joan Thompson, have been building our local economy and helping local people with HVAC systems 16 years. Ducts, Indoor Air Professionals. Call 876-9907. 876-9907. Ducks. Call now.
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
News Talk 1240.
You love your hometown. Are you interested in free markets, in local economy? Do you hope that Chattanooga can survive the next meltdown, the next chain of disasters in the national economy? What's the best way to live out the ideals of self-government and self-determination? Join me, David Toulis, weekdays 1 to 3.
Hot News Talk 1240.
Love your neighbor, buy local.
Hot News Talk 1240.
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
News Talk 1240.
Fox News Radio. I'm Lillian Wu. Cuba no longer considered a state sponsor of terrorism by the U.S.
The decision to remove Cuba was made a while back, though today the 45-day waiting period expires for Congress to make any objections to that. Congress has not objected to removing Cuba from that list, which had precluded Cuba or any other nation on that list from having a lot of access to U.S. banking services as well as international banking services.
Fox Radio's Evan Brown. All 3 suspects now arrested in the shooting of an Oklahoma police officer. That third suspect who fled after crashing a car he allegedly stole was captured near Liberty, Kansas. And at One World Trade Center in New York City, a ceremony as the observatory gets open to the public. One World Observatory at the tallest building in the country, up more than 100 floors. Fox News, we report, you decide.
There are people posting online. Not going to name names because, people can think what they want. I'm fine with that. I'm not one of those guys who gets mad when people think differently than I do, I guess. I have plenty of friends who are communists, I have plenty of friends who are anarchists. I have plenty of friends who are Democrats and Republicans and all sorts. So I don't really get upset when people think differently than I do. I apologize, by the way. I have a bit of a cold, so if I sound odd, that's why. So I don't get upset when people think differently than I do. It's not really something that bothers me, right? Somebody thinks that we are the greatest nation on earth and that we are we are totally we have the best moral authority, and we can bomb everybody with impunity. You can think that. I mean, it's unrealistic, but you can think that, and that's fine. And I'm not going to get upset. Now, if you got into a debate with me, things would be a little bit different. I still wouldn't get upset, but I'd be willing to defend my point. But I'm not going to get angry about it, right? I mean, it's not going to come to fisticuffs if that's how it is. I'm not a violent person, I guess. I'm very laid back. I'm not into the whole violence thing, which is, I guess, a little bit funny considering how much I really like guns, and I really am pretty interested in martial arts in a sense. I take Shinsei Hapkido and I take Shotokan, and I'm not a violent person. Maybe that's part of the local economy attitude, though. I was thinking about that the other day, and how I'm really a laid back sort of guy. And I was kind of wondering why that is, because I have such extreme thoughts on a lot of things. I'm a very extreme sort of guy when it comes to my political opinions. But I'm really very laid back. I'm not very violent at all. I don't like the idea of harming another human being simply because of how they think, or simply because they said something that I didn't like. Harming them for that seems to be sort of a waste of time to me. Not really, like, I haven't convinced him of anything in breaking his nose or in dislocating his shoulder. I've not really convinced him of any point. So there's no real point in doing that. So I don't really put much stock in violence as a solution to a problem. It oftentimes is not, and we're even taught that in my class. Violence is not the solution to much of any problem. Only use violent tactics when you are being attacked yourself physically, right? So that's the only solution that's the only case that's a solution for the problem, is to dispel a physical threat. And I apply that mentality to foreign policy, for example, and I apply that mentality to data collection as well. If there's a time and a place where somebody is actively working to attack one person, then we can start talking about using violence to dispel that, right? Then we can start talking about using violence to disperse that effort. But until that happens, that's really not appropriate. And I think that should be everyone's philosophy. But for some reason, people get very upset about really what amounts to something that's very minor, and they call for somebody's death. Right? Like, okay, for instance, there was a case just recently, and I'm not defending this occurring by any means, but there's a case just recently where it appeared that a bald eagle had been shot. Now, that's terrible, right? There's no defending that happening. But people on Facebook were calling for whoever did this to be killed immediately and all these sorts of things. This person should be shot. This person should be killed. This person should be strung up. And I was thinking, well, that's not very American. What about a fair trial? What about a jury of your peers? What about all these different things which that supposedly represents that he shot? So in saying all this, you're actually being very un-American when it comes right down to it. If you're going to be going about the whole, you're going to be going about the whole violent method of solving this problem instead of the legal and just method, then that's not very American when it comes right down to it, because that's not very constitutional and thus not very American. Now it starts to make some people look like violent extremists, which they possibly are. Right? I mean, I don't know. But it's something that has to be kept in mind. And I think this is an important lesson that needs to be learned. This is an extremely important lesson that needs to be learned, which is this. Only think about somebody else caring about a violent act if you yourself are willing to carry out that violent act yourself. When people talk about hanging this guy, people talk about shooting this guy in the back of the head. The guy committed a crime, possibly, right? It could have been an accident. We don't know, but a trial will determine that. So if you're talking about committing a violent act, are you yourself willing to pull that trigger? Are you yourself willing to string somebody up? Are you yourself willing to beat somebody up to death, possibly? Are you willing to bludgeon somebody possibly to death? If you won't do that yourself, then how can you call other people to do that for you? That's called that's very very militant. That's very nationalistic, and it's very very reactionary. And that's not the way that America was meant to be structured. The United States is not meant to be structured that way. I keep saying America as though America is a country. It's not. The United States is. America is a continent, North America and South America. But anyway, the United States is not meant to be structured that way in its original foundation. The United States is meant to be founded on reason and on seeking the truth and valuing the truth and on justice. Truth, justice is the American way. That's not beating somebody up for doing something that we disagree with, right? It's a fair trial. And it's a very important thing to remember. It's a very important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about committing acts of violence against people who may have made a mistake or may have done something wrong, sure, but not something that really harmed anyone else other than what amounts to a symbol and nothing more. So you have to keep these things in mind. When we're talking about acts of violence against other people, would you be willing to do that yourself? If not, then how can you call other people to do that? It's something that's food for thought, I suppose. Well, the United Nations, and I don't put much stock in the United Nations, by the way. The United Nations says that encryption is necessary for the exercise of the right to freedom. Oh, well, hey, I mean, can't go wrong there, right? The UN is actually kind of right in this decision. So the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner released a report on Thursday heralding encryption, but it was wishy-washy when it came to government-mandated backdoors to undermine encryption. So they're being wishy-washy on the very important point that everyone's been debating. So the UN has all these grand solutions to all of our terrible problems, which is usually send in people in blue helmets to shoot people who disagree with democracy or something along those lines. And that's usually the solution to every problem from the UN. Well, their solution to the encryption problem is to give a wishy-washy answer, which is really a non-answer. But the statement from the UN is this: encryption and anonymity and the security concepts behind them provide the privacy and security necessary for the exercise of the right to freedom of opinion and expression in the digital age. Such security may be essential for the exercise of other rights, including economic rights, privacy, due process, freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and the right to life and bodily integrity. So all of those things are protected by encryption, potentially. So taking away those things would be a violation of potentially all of those rights, you'd think, right? Well, unless it's done by a government, right? Unless it's a backdoor, then it's okay. So again, this is an example of it's terrible if we do it, but it's okay if the government does it. And it's very inconsistent, and we keep seeing that repeatedly. This is not the first time that the UN has weighed in on the digital age. By the way, this story comes from Ars Technica. In 2011, it declared internet access a human right. Now, I'm not sure if I agree with that. I think the purchase of internet access is certainly a human right. You have the right to purchase this. It's certainly true. But you don't have a fundamental right to the internet, to access to the internet, in the same way that you have a fundamental right to free speech in that sense, right? The internet actually does cost something. There is a cost exchange for the internet. When you're paying something, you're paying money for the internet. Now you're paying for your right to access that internet, right? So it's not necessarily a right in that sense, where it's like you have a right to eat. You know, you have a right to do these certain things, and there's even biblical backing for that too. But the internet is a little bit different. Now, I'm certainly a firm believer and defender of the internet, right? There's no doubting that. If you've heard the show at all before, you know that. But is it a fundamental right to the point where everyone should have it, no questions asked, without them paying any money for it? Well, that starts to be a little bit different. You have a right to purchase access to the internet. That's absolutely true. You do, and you should. But you don't have it as a fundamental right which should be given up for free, right? Which should be given to you for free. There is a cost to running the internet. And if it's subsidized, then that in the process of the internet being brought to you is going to degrade in value, and it's going to degrade in quality as well, because government subsidized things tend to not be very well built. Well, anyway, this is not the first time that the UN has weighed in on these things. A latest report by Special Rapporteur David Kay comes amid government calls from the United Nations, the United States, to Europe for technology companies to provide access, authorities access to so-called backdoors into encrypted apps and services. So the United States is playing the bully again, asking the European districts, whatever you want to call them, the European bloc, for access into encrypted services. So the United States is being a bully yet again. The latest official to enter the backdoor chorus was National Security Agency Chief Mike Rogers, who said on Wednesday that governments would be given access to encrypted products just like they do with telephone communications, saying, why can't we create a similar kind of framework within the internet and the digital age? He said, well, it might be because it was wrong with telephone communications and it's wrong with encrypted applications. The UN report said government-ordered encryption, or decryption rather, was okay if done by a case-by-case basis. Not sure I agree with that. States should not restrict encryption and anonymity, which facilitate and often enable the rights to freedom of opinion and expression. Blanket prohibitions fail to be necessary and proportionate. States should avoid all measures that weaken the security that individuals may enjoy online, such as backdoors, weak encryption standards, and key escrows. In addition, states should refrain from making identification of users a condition for access to digital communications and online services and requiring SIM card registration for mobile users. Corporate actors should likewise consider their own policies that restrict encryption and anonymity, including through the use of pseudonyms. Court-ordered decryption subject to domestic and international law may only be permissible when it results from transparent and publicly accessible laws applied solely on a targeted case-by-case basis to individuals, i.e. not to a mass of people, and subject to judicial warrant and the protection of due process rights of individuals. So, all of that to say, basically, governments should only be decrypting communications on a case-by-case basis. Now, does the government have a right? Well, actually, governments don't have rights. Does the government have the power to decrypt your cell phone communications? Is that a constitutionally granted power? Well, again, I'll direct you to the Fourth Amendment, which pretty clearly says they can, but only with a warrant, which shall issue upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. That's the only time. So that's the only case where this is okay, is when you have a warrant that was granted based on oath or affirmation, and it's a specific thing that's going to be searched. That's the only time that this can happen, you see. It's quite simple. So for some reason, the government is wanting an easy-to-access backdoor into phone communications, and fortunately for us, companies such as Google and Apple are having nothing of it. Fortunately for us, these companies seem to value privacy much more than the federal government does. And again, there's no point in having any faith in the federal government at this point anyway, because they're just going to violate our rights. And it seems like, oddly enough, companies are doing a better job of protecting us than the federal government is. Very weird, very strange. It's like we're living in a sort of bizarro world where things are reversed. Well, this is the very nature of a government anyway, though. This is the very nature of a state. A state has to degrade. And there were systems set in place for the state to go under, perhaps we'll call it a controlled demolition, but that time for that is sort of gone and past. And really, all we have to do is sit back and wait. And it reminds me of the Onion article, the Onion headline that I thought was really funny. The Onion is a satirical website that offers up satirical news, and it's really, really funny. And the latest, or one of their headlines a while ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, was Al-Qaeda's new plan has been discovered by the FBI, which is to sit back and watch the collapse of the United States. And I thought that was really funny because it's so true. You know, that is the plan, is to just sit back and watch it collapse, because that's what has to happen at this point. It absolutely has to happen. Collapse is inevitable, and that's okay. That's not bad, actually. A lot of people may think that it's oh my gosh, you know, the world is going to collapse and the world pivots on the fulcrum of the United States, but that's not really entirely the case. If there was suddenly a government which ceased to exist, if our government ceased to exist suddenly, would you become a violent person all of a sudden? Would you become somebody who's going to go looting and is going to go shooting people who ever sets foot in your driveway, right? Are you going to become a person who rides around like in Mad Max and you're going to shoot people in order to obtain gasoline, and you're going to be just the worst person ever? You're going to become a dictator. Is that what's going to happen if there's collapse of government? Well, not really, actually. I very much doubt that. If there was collapse of government, I would probably go to work exactly like I do right now. Corporations would not cease to exist simply because there's lack of government. Now, sure, they would lose a very big customer. Companies such as Alcatel or Boeing or what's the other one? Lockheed might see a bit of a punch to the wallet, but they probably wouldn't go out of business. I mean, yeah, they're government contractors by trade. Mostly what they do is from government contracts. So those companies might be in a bit of trouble, but we'd still be able to buy gas probably at a much more inflated rate, but we'd still be able to buy gas. There would be no more taxes also if there was a collapse of government. So you might pay less for gas depending on the circumstances. So the idea behind this massive panic, if there's suddenly a loss of government, I think is misguided. It might be actually perpetrated by government. If there's a collapse of government and everyone goes nuts, then that idea of people just going nuts due to there being a lack of government might actually be perpetrated by the government to make us believe that we need them. And it doesn't appear that we actually do need them. We, more often than not, don't, it seems. And when's the last time you sat back and you thought, boy, sure, I'm glad the government helped me out there? Probably not very often. Now, sure, there would be people who are currently on welfare who might have some problems adjusting to a non-governmental society. But again, there are charities, there are charitable people who would certainly be willing to help them. I'm sure there are churches, right? People tithe to their churches. I'm sure those churches could take a hit instead of spending money on that brand new youth wing they were working on. I'm sure they could spend some of that money on helping out the poor, which is, kind of what they're supposed to be doing anyway. So it seems that the government is trying to take the place of your mother, your father, your church, your everything, your doctor, your broker, everything. The government has been for a very long time trying to take the place of these things, and it's really not entirely the government's fault. To say that it's all the government's fault would be a misconception, because really we're to blame too. Maybe not so much the most recent generations, although I'd say my generation is certainly to blame for a lot of the ills that we have. It's really a fault of a system, a systematic sense of apathy. The wrong sort of apathy, I should say. Now, there's a controlled apathy that's certainly good when we're talking about caring about what the government does on a day-to-day basis, because that seems to be nonsensical a lot of the time. But when we're talking about an apathy about what the government is actually doing to infringe our rights, and we don't really think much of it a lot of the time. Well, think about this. You have to get a driver's license to drive on the roads, right? Sure. Well, that's an infringement of your right to travel. See? You don't even think of it as that, but it is. Requiring you to get a license is permission to do something which would otherwise be illegal. So they're requiring you to get permission to do something which is actually legal, thus an infringement of your right to travel. Now, not a lot of people see it that way. And I can understand why. It's a far-out concept. But you do have right to travel. Believe it or not, you have that right to travel, despite what they try to do to tell you don't, or despite what they try to do to infringe upon that right. You still have it. Okay, think about it this way. If you're a believer in God, and somebody tells you God doesn't exist, does God cease to exist? Well, no, of course not. If you're a believer in God, then God exists for you. It's all, that's what it's based upon, is your belief, right? You believe God exists. And so God continues to exist, whether or not somebody tells you that he doesn't. It's a pretty simple concept, actually. But if somebody tells you that God doesn't exist, then you're not going to say, oh, you're right, suddenly he doesn't. Well, if somebody walks up to the street and tells you, hey, did you hear the federal government says you don't have a right to free speech? Are you going to go, oh, you're right, I don't now? Well, no, of course you have a right to free speech. Of course you have a right to travel. Of course you have a right to bear arms. Of course you have a right to be protected from searches and seizures. Of course you have a right to self-defense. All these different rights that you have, of course you have them, whether or not the government says you have them or not. Of course you have them. Your rights don't come from the government. This is a thought which is, I'm sure, not tried to be countered by the federal government, right? To tell you that your rights come from the government. I'm sure they don't try to counter that idea, but your rights do not come from the government. There's simply no way that they could. If your rights are based upon the fickle existence of a man-made entity, then they would be worth absolutely nothing. So, of course, you have all these different rights. Of course you do. And don't be afraid of them going away, because they can't. You still have them no matter what the government tries to do. I hear this phrase all the time. The government's trying to take away my right to do da-da-da-da-da. No, they can't do that. No, they could try, sure, but they're not going to take away your right to do anything. They can't do that. You still have it no matter what. It's a God-given right. If they could alter something that's given from on high, then the government would be God, and the government is not, fortunately. So we don't have to worry about rights being taken away. We can worry about rights being not recognized, perhaps, sure, but being taken away, not so much. Did you hear about the FBI stealing seizing the domain of megaupload.com? Well, megaupload.com way back in the day was a really popular file sharing website. I used it. Everybody I knew used it. will.i.am used it. A lot of different popular artists used Mega Upload. Well, the FBI seized megaupload.com, and I would not recommend that you go to that website right now. Megaupload.com is, in fact, now a pornography website, whereas it was not before. It used to be owned by Kim.com, and it was a file sharing website. Well, it's expired and is now no longer that. Earlier this week, according to Ars Technica, something suspicious started happening with web addresses related to sites seized by the FBI from Mega Upload and a number of online gambling sites. Instead of directing browsers to a page with an FBI banner, they started dropping web surfers onto malicious feeds of web advertisements, some of them laden with malware. The hijacking of the Mega Upload domains wasn't the result of some sophisticated hack based on evidence collected by Ars Technica, it appears someone at the FBI Cyber Division failed to renew the domain registration for searfu.net, which is the domain which in turn hosted web and name servers used to redirect traffic headed towards seized domains. So basically, somebody over at the FBI forgot to sign certain papers or to use the company credit card to buy new space at searfu.net. As a result of this, now megaupload.com redirects to sometimes pornographic, malicious ads. Ads? My southern accent kicked in. Ads. Don't you hate that? Malicious ads. So as of Thursday afternoon, all the server names associated with the domain no longer resolve to internet addresses. GoDaddy has apparently suspended the domain registration, and Earl Grey has been ranting about it ever since on Twitter. The searfu.net domain currently remains in limbo. So somebody at the FBI is going on paid leave, I can tell you that. Ars Technica attempted to reach the person behind the domain grab, but of course got no response. Requests for comment from the FBI, of course, also went unanswered, but DNS records and details provided by GoDaddy.com security staff paint a pretty clear picture of what happened, and it's not very pretty. So it appears somebody over at the FBI forgot to use a company credit card to renew the domain. An April 3rd retrieval of a Whois record showed that the domain had expired without renewal. Now, I don't know about you. I have a website. I actually do have a website, Boyden.party. Don't use it yet because it's not finished. But, okay, David Toulis has a website, Nuganomics.com. Totally cool website. Definitely check it out. He owns the domain to Nuganomics.com. And I'm sure he's never forgotten to renew that domain. So this is a very easy thing to do, right? Even for those of us who maybe aren't so tech savvy, this is an easy thing to do. You get a bill in the mail or you get a bill in your email and you pay it. Well, the FBI probably has no shortage of money to pay off these little internet bills. So somebody is really, really in trouble over at the FBI. On May 13th, the domain's registration was changed to SNYDK8 Media Limited, a company at an address in Gibraltar, because it expired. It was up for grabs. They bought it. A company at an address in Gibraltar. The address is occupied by Form A Company Gibraltar Limited, which is a company that handles the registration of companies in Gibraltar, mail and phone fax forwarded addresses, and yacht registration and such. But again, they didn't do anything illegal. The domain expired, and this company snapped it up. They do that. That's how the internet works. A domain expires, and somebody buys it. So the domain that was previously seized by the FBI expired, and a company bought it. So what's the FBI to do? Try to seize that domain again? We don't know yet. Well, this is Digital Drive, and that's just another example of the ineptitude of the federal government. It's no surprise. What's not inept, though, is local economy. And somebody to talk about that is David Toulis right here on Nuganomics.com, coming up on Hot News Talk Radio.
This is a mob world. This is the mob world. What kind of fool do you think I am? You think I know nothing about my...
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
News Talk 1240.
Surgery does not have to be financially painful. Hi, I'm Surgical Dr. David Red, and I'd like to invite you to my walk-in surgery clinic in North Shore. Quick Surge brings you immediate relief from moles, skin tags, maybe a laceration. Quick Surge. You walk in, fill out a mini form, I numb the area I'll treat, and before you know it, you're on your way home. Do I take insurance? No, because I take cash customers. I have super low and fixed prices, credit card, check, or cash. Uninsured? Member of the working financially disadvantaged? Choose Quick Surge. I publish prices online. No murk, just sunshine. Hassle-free, pain-free. Love the idea of a personal relationship with a doctor? Drop in with a nasty cut from work. Quick Surge. I'll take care of you. Quick Surge is a public center on the North Shore. No insurance hassles with Quick Surge. The national medical system is dysfunctional, overpriced, very alienating. I'm part of the solution, and so are you. Come on home. QuickSurge.com. QUIK.